Hoople's Cat and Mr. Bear. Today we're going to do the end of Long Voyage Back, and you're going to get to watch me read it. Hopefully this will go well. And at the end we'll have a little pie. Page 389. When the gale lessened and the wind shifted, they sailed on through the straits. They were sailing mechanically now, without real hope that they would ever see the Pacific, but sailing because all other alternatives were worse. They had barely made 100 miles over the first 3 days, sailing only during the 8 hours of daylight, anchoring at night. Neil at least was able to stand watch again. Just kidding, I'm going to put pictures up. I know that's kind of the best part of this, but Mr. Bear will return unless he moves, okay? The absence of any sign of life during their first days in the Straits made them suspect there couldn't be a small bustling city only a little way off. As they neared the place in the Straits where their map showed Punta Arenas to be, and they still had seen no boats, no smoke, no planes, they decided there couldn't be much of a military presence, and thus humans in Punta Arenas might not be a threat, might in fact be helpful and sympathetic. So they proceeded to try it by day. Uncertain of their exact location, they had almost sailed past the town when Philip spotted it through binoculars 3 miles to the north. The charred wreckage of buildings and a few small houses on the hillside. Nervously they altered course to sail over. Although the temperatures were in the 40s and the scene that drew them towards was bleak, all the buildings on the waterfront were blackened shells or burned to the ground. The hulks of a large freighter and several smaller ships lay half sunk along the waterfront. As they anchored off a burned out wharf, a few stray dogs scurried like overgrown rats among the blackened timbers of the wreckage. The hills over the town were brown and grey, with only occasional patches of white from the recent snow. Nowhere was there any sign of human life. Mr. Bear's left. You'll hear him nesting in his box. So fearful of man had those aboard Vagabond become that the emptiness of the city was as much a relief as a source of sadness. Neil, who had joined the others on deck, felt the same sense of being an alien on another planet that he had felt at each of their last landfalls. They had lowered their dinghy into the water, and Jim, Neil and Sheila were preparing to go ashore when 2, 3 and then half a dozen people appeared along one small section of unburned bulkhead 50 feet away. There were 4 men, a woman and a child. 2 of the men were carrying rifles. All were dressed in woolen ponchos and several wore the distinctive bowler hats of the Andes. The Chileans stared at the trimer and its occupants, who stared back. Then one of the men with a rifle shouted something. Jean, frowning, shouted back in Spanish a request that he say it again. The man shouted the same thing a second time. Jean frowned a moment and then consulted with Sheila. "What's he saying?" Neil asked. "As near as we can tell," said Jean with a puzzled smile on her face, "he's saying, roughly translated, 'Hi, where the hell did you get that weird boat?'" In the next 2 days, after making friends with the few Chileans who were still living in Punta Arenas, they gradually learned that the city had been destroyed in a brief war between Chile and Argentina 10 weeks earlier. No one was certain why the war had started, although the two countries had long disputed over parts of Terra del Fuego. It wasn't even certain who'd won the war, but Argentinian jets had destroyed the city and sunk most of the Chilean ships during the 4 days of fighting. With the city almost destroyed, the Chilean government had ordered it evacuated, perhaps because they were obliged to under the peace treaty, perhaps because they were willing to spend money supplying with food and fuel during the winter. Thousands of people had sailed off in freighters and navy ships for Santiago, leaving less than 100 people who had either chosen to stay or got left behind out of ignorance. There was no phone, radio, road or air contact between this part of Chile and the more civilized parts further north. A single Chilean navy ship had turned up a month ago, looked around and disappeared. They also learned that the Vagabond was not the only ship to have arrived since the town's destruction. 6 weeks before, an English sailboat arrived, made some repairs, repositioned as best they could and sailed on. A damaged Dutch sloop had arrived 3 weeks earlier and beached a mile to the east. A Romanian sailboat arrived only 3 days before Vagabond. The small, wiry Chilean man in his 30s, who had become their unofficial guide, joked that Punta Arenas had become the new French Riviera. They met the crews of both ships, and for Neil and the others, friendly people were unreal. The absence of threat was vaguely unnerving. The chance to live on land, perhaps in the shell of a house, seemed too good to be true. Food was very scarce. Spring, although it officially began on September 21st, the day they arrived, was still almost a month away. The friendly Chileans had no provisions to spare, but they did show the sailors where they could hunt small game, mostly rodents and wild dogs, and where they could gather shellfish. It was unreal too to meet the 3 Dutchmen and 1 woman and her 8-year-old child who were making a winter home a mile east of Punta Arenas while they tried to repair their hold 38-foot fiberglass sloop. Two of the Dutch spoke good English, as did one of the Romanians. They, along with 6 others, 2 of them women, had sailed a 48-foot fiberglass ketch all the way from the Black Sea. It was also anchored east of the wrecked town. Each of the crews was wary and suspicious of the other for a day or two. It wasn't until they shared stories of their long voyage of survival that they all began not only to trust one another but to feel a bond of brotherhood. The Romanians, like those aboard Vagabond, were still in shock after being greeted with friendliness by fellow human beings. The Dutch had fled Amsterdam on the first morning of the war, landing briefly in Portugal and again in the Canary Islands for supplies. They hadn't encountered the resentment and violence that fleeing Americans had experienced. No one blamed the Dutch for the war. But conditions were harsh in the Canaries. The island crowded with European refugees and food so scarce that aristocrats with millions of dollars in gold found it almost useless. The Dutch decided to sail across to Argentina, which, they thought, had plenty of food and would welcome them. When they landed in a small Argentinian fishing village, they learned that they would lose their boat and be interned. They opted to try for the South Pacific. The Romanian story was more harrowing. Vacationing on the Black Sea when the war began, they had all, including the 3 Communist Party members aboard, decided the war was a meaningless disaster and chosen to run. By the time they got to the Bosphorus, a nuclear explosion had blocked the straits to all commercial and military traffic, but they were able to sail through. They touched on North Africa only once, losing 2 of their shipmates in an attack by brigands, then escaped out through the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. They stopped in Cape Verde to reprovision but found food so scarce they could obtain almost nothing. Sailing on, they had been dismasted in a storm off Brazil, spent 3 weeks in a jungle south of the Amazon fitting another mast, and then sailed on. They too had been attacked by a jet, an Argentinian jet, but it had fired just once, missed literally by a mile, and then flown off. The Dutch and the Romanians seemed surrealistically skinny and bony at first until Neil realised that he must look even worse. It took Neil and Jean and the others only 2 days to decide their plan to sail on soon to the South Pacific was madness born of their desperation. They had no food and little prospect of getting much until the summer offered a chance to plant and harvest crops. Jean was pregnant, Lisa and Ollie still very weak, although both were out of bed now. Sheila and Jean pulled 2 of Ollie's rotting teeth a week earlier, and his debilitating low-grade fever was disappearing. He'd recovered sufficiently to pinch Sheila's behind and had begun entertaining himself and the others again with monologues. On the 3rd day, they moved Vagabond east to Beecher, closer to the other sailboats. The terrain was desolate. The few trees were twisted like grotesque cripples by the fierce westerly winds. Aboard Vagabond, as Philip and Sheila and Lisa began preparing to cook a wild dog Jim had caught and killed, Ollie suggested a barbecue. Philip said that of course that was the easiest way to cook, the only way, but Ollie shook his head. "I mean a real barbecue," he said, "with people, talk, laughter, you know, like they do on Smith Island." "You mean invite other people?" asked Jean. "Sure," said Ollie. "Shit, this poor critter's so thin and bony, none of us are going to get fat anyhow. But we've got to give him his self-respect, make him feel he's worthy of dying for us." They all stared at him. "Share their first meet in a month?" "Who will we invite?" said Jean. "Well, those fellas with the funny round hats for one," said Ollie. "Everyone," said Neil. "What?" said Philip. "We'll invite everyone," Neil repeated almost dreamily. "We'll invite everyone." "By God, that's a bloody good idea, Neil," Philip said, grinning. "To share with friends again, even if it leaves us back with dry grasses and barnacles." "Don't criticise barnacles, dear," said Sheila. "Lisa and I are concocting a marvellous barnacle salad." "Save it for the barbecue," said Neil. "Save everything good. Tomorrow we'll share every bit of food we have, so we can start from scratch." "Bit mad, I suppose," said Philip, still smiling. "Still, it beats hoarding." Jim was the official messenger, and he spoke first to their little Chilean guide, who nodded and looked pleased and hurried away to tell his friends. But the Dutch were confused and wary. "You want to share your food with us?" the oldest Dutchman asked, frowning. "Yes," said Jim, "but we only have the dog. We don't have much else to eat or drink. It's what you call potluck, no?" the Dutchman said, smiling. "Yeah, and bring your own bottle," added another, also smiling. "Yeah, I guess so," said Jim, "but you don't have to bring anything." "Well, we'll come," said the oldest Dutchman. "We'll come with much thanks." The Romanians were even more dumbfounded. Jim could sense that they suspected some kind of a trap. They greeted him with their rifles at port arms. They whispered together in Romanian, glancing at him nervously. "Why you do this?" the Romanian captain asked after he had finally understood Jim's invitation. "You have much food?" "No," said Jim, "but we decided to share what we have." "You want us to share our food too, no?" Jim frowned. "We want to share our food with you," he finally said. "It seems right to us, that's all. We bring our guns?" "I guess so," Jim replied. "We don't have any guns." "Ah, no guns." "We'd be honoured if you'd come to eat with us," Jim repeated. "Honoured? Yes," echoed the Romanian, looking puzzled. "Well, maybe we come. We see." 2 o'clock, said Jim. 2 o'clock. Yes, well, and meat you say? Well, an honour? Yes, maybe we come. And so at 2 o'clock the next afternoon, the 5 Dutch and 7 Romanians and 12 Chileans came. The Dutch and the Romanians approached as warily as if they were threading their way through a minefield. The Chileans, having already accepted the weirdness of their latest visitors, came fearlessly. The Dutch brought their last flask of wine and a specially baked loaf of bread, their first in a week. The Romanians brought a tiny tin, their last, of caviar and a freshly caught and baked fish. The Chileans brought a basket of corn and some of their homemade wine. No one brought guns. And they ate. And although each was limited to a small cup of wine, a single cob of corn, and a few bites of tough, stringy dog meat, they ate happily and slowly, very slowly. It began to dawn on each of the Vagabond's crew members that they might live. For Neil, it was the friendliness of the Chileans and the Dutch and the Romanians, expressed primarily in exaggerated gestures of delight at the feast and continual smiles, that made him realise that some deep part of him had begun to feel that he would be running on the edge of death forever. Now the act of sharing the treasured bit of wine with Jacob and his friends, and a pipeful of tobacco with one of the Romanians, altered his view of things entirely. The running, at long last, was over. The Romanians and Dutch had decided, as they had, to remain in the streets at least through the summer. Although everyone left in the destroyed city was on starvation rations, Vagabond was now in fact totally out of food. Fishing in the streets was good, there were small animals to be hunted, and spring was now only a few weeks away. To the north, the wars that they had fled were presumably continuing. Here, at the bottom of the world, a few survivors had gathered. They were still struggling to survive, but now with each other rather than against. It was a small first step on the long voyage back. It was Ollie who summed up the new feeling. He came up to Neil and Jean after an hour of feasting and mingling and unfolding his monologues with 24 strangers, few of whom understood him. There were tears in his eyes. "I've been feeling funny," he said to them, "and I think I finally figured out what it is." He looked up at them, a laughing skeleton. "I may have to get used to living again." Well, there you have it, except for the postscript. This is a work of fiction. The actual effects of a large-scale nuclear war would be so much worse than I've described that no bearable work of fiction could ever be written about them. Thanks for listening. It's been over a year and SHF still hasn't happened, nor has nuclear war, and we're all still alive, and I hope we're all still as happy as we can be. And I did promise a bit of a party. Unfortunately, Mr. Bear's collapsed on the floor, but the party aspect of this will be if you can answer some questions and email me at hooplescat@outlook.com with the correct answers, there will be prizes. Because of weight and postage, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to send Amazon gift certificates or Canadian dollar bills, and then you'll have to figure it out because postage is awful. And anyway, so are you guys ready to answer the questions? It will be, whoever gets them right will go into a draw, okay? And the questions are from the book, so you may have to, if you have the book you have an advantage, but I do like reading, so that's fine with me. Otherwise you might have to skip back and look. So I will read the page numbers to make it easier. Page 6, an American reconnaissance plane shot down by an Iraqi missile. Who did they claim in the book was manning the launching system? Which nation? Page 31. Neil's listening to a radio station done by a person in, I believe, East Tennessee. What is the name of the person that he's listening to? First and last names. Page 49. What's the name of Jean, Lisa and Bill and Skippy's dog? Page 71. Frank is in a bit of a state, so Frank decides that he will hire a plane to go back to New York. What's the full name, first and last, of the pilot that he approaches that will take him on this journey? Just to make it a little tougher for the people who have the book, how do you spell Frank's last name? I believe it's mentioned but once. What's the name of Captain Ollie's boat? Page 160 and elsewhere. What's the first city that the vagabond ports in after leaving the Cheapspake? In that city, Neil decides to go and see about being drafted back into the Navy. What's the name of the boat that he goes on? This is page 181. Page 183, the boat he goes aboard is a subchaser. He knows the captain of that boat. The captain's name is Craig Bonneville. What is the captain of that boat's naval rank? Page 204, the newly drafted American army in the city that they're in decides to go and take all the food from a bunch of farmers because they know the farmers and all the animals are going to die from radioactivity but haven't bothered to tell them. A rather stoned corporal on page 204 names that the Battle of... The vagabond comes upon a boat that's suffering from radiation poisoning, and the man and his wife and his daughter on the boat. The man and the wife and the daughter are basically dying from radiation poisoning, and the wife and the daughter have been raped. I believe the daughter's been raped. What's the name of that boat? Why did the vagabond decide that they weren't going to go to San Juan? On page 279, a Boeing 747 is shot down by the Venezuelan Air Force. Where had that Boeing 747 taken off from? Page 311. When Jean goes aboard the Mollycoddle, which is the pirate's boat, and didn't ask you that one, she meets a guy called Michael. How do you spell Michael's last name? While in St. Thomas, there are two vessels that are coming to port to evacuate basically white people. One of them is called the Norway. What is the name of the other boat? Again on 322. What is the Norway's destination? Which country is the Norway going to go to after evacuating white people from St. Thomas? Katya dies. She's swept overboard. We don't see her death, but we assume it, and it's probably likely. But there's a piece of equipment on the Vagabond that's also damaged and destroyed during this gale where they lose Katya. What do they lose on page 331 that looks for a time having ended their trip? Before the Vagabond goes to Punta Arenas, what is the name of the last boat that the Vagabond is paired up with on the last leg of the journey to Punta Arenas? It doesn't go to Punta Arenas with them, it goes to Barbados. What's the name of the boat? That boat fires a flare to make a signal to the Vagabond on page 357. What colour is the flare and what does it mean? Page 373. The Vagabond's attacked by the Brazilian Air Force. Bit of overkill, Brazil, come on guys. And what saves the Vagabond from being destroyed during that attack? Okay, this is it. Remember, money, Amazon gift cards, not telling you how much, depends how many people enter. Very at the end of the book, they have a party, a barbecue, with the Romanians, the Chileans and the Dutch. What time does that barbecue start? And also, what do the Romanians bring to the party?